He is a lecturer at San Diego State University teaching fraud examination and forensic accounting. He is also the CEO, founder of the Fraud Protection Institute, providing anti-fraud training and consulting for organizations. He is the current president of the San Diego chapter of the ACFE and a certified leadership coach and trainer. And before teaching, Jim spent over 30 years in financial services and has been a CFE since 2008. He's going to be talking to you about the power of culture, fraud awareness from the top down. Jim, how you doing today?
I am doing great. Thank you, Rob.
Fantastic. This is a hot topic. Fraud is everywhere, and you've got 30 minutes to help our attendees understand things from your perspective. And again, they'll be sending you some questions, maybe even chiming in during your session, and you'll be able to take on those questions with your expertise.
Absolutely. Well, like you said, I've got 30 minutes, and I'll tell you what, Rob, this is one of the topics that I'm most passionate about, because what I find this is something that organizations tend to overlook, which is part of what we'll talk about today.
Okay, Jim, over to you for the next 30 minutes, my friend.
Sounds great. Thanks, Rob. All right. So what we're going to talk about today, and I'm so glad that everyone is here, and hopefully you had the opportunity to sit in on the keynote session yesterday. But what we're going to do is, we've just had our introduction. We're going to talk about what it takes to build a fraud-resistant culture. We introduced that topic yesterday. We talked about why it's important. So we'll just review a couple things there. And specifically, we're going to get into implementing a comprehensive fraud awareness training program and why that's important and what are some of the key elements of that. And we'll wrap up with some practical steps and tools to implement this type of program. And again, we'll have Q&A at the end, but please, this is an interactive session. So as Rob said, I invite your questions along the way. So yesterday when we were talking, one of the things we talked about, this should look familiar, we talked about the fact that we have different pockets of employees as far as measuring, as far as basically their approach to honesty. We've got about 30% of individuals, 30% of employees who will be honest regardless of the situation. We've got about another 30% that have a tendency towards dishonesty and will be dishonest or deceitful whenever it serves them. And then we have what we call the situationally honest, which is about 40%. And in that case, we've got individuals who tend to go with the flow and tend to do what the situation warrants. It's best for them, but also they pay attention to the things that are going on around them. So I want you to just keep that in the back of your mind as we move forward through this discussion. So remember, our role as leadership and our goal and objective as leadership is to create a culture that is honest, to create a culture of honesty, create a culture of openness where there's open communication and transparency. We want a culture of assistance where employees know that if they're having issues, if they're having difficulties, that they can speak up and ask for help. We want a positive work environment. We want one that the code of conduct and code of ethics is very evident and is a living, breathing thing rather than something that gets read once a year, signed off on and put in a drawer. And again, we want that regular transparency, regular communication training so that employees feel involved, engaged, and up to date. And this is important, as we talked about yesterday, because an employee that feels engaged, an employee that feels some level of ownership in what's going on and is valued is going to be far less likely to want to cheat the organization, as opposed to an individual who feels left out, who feels in the dark, who feels maybe they're not being heard or fairly treated. then we start to run into some issues where maybe that's somebody who it would be more likely to do something to harm the organization. So again, what are some of those elements of an ethical culture? And again, what's really important is that number one, the leadership clearly communicates what the values and principles of the organization are. This should be done from the start. This should be an ongoing thing. Again, we want open communication channels so that this is an ongoing discussion. And when we're talking specifically about fraud, we want to make sure this is not an organization where fraud is an F word. And unfortunately, in too many organizations, fraud is just not, it's not okay to talk about it. So we need to openly talk about that and have that as part of our open communication. And not only do we need that communication, not only do we need those values and principles clearly communicated to our employees and throughout the organization, what's really crucial and probably the number one thing here is that we have a tone at the top where the leadership behavior is consistent with the communication. And remember, yesterday we defined tone at the top as a visible willingness by senior management to let values drive decisions and to prioritize those values among above all other factors. And that includes financial results, and to expect everyone in the organization to live up to those values and principles. And part of that, of course, is going to be having regular ethics and fraud training, which is what we're going to be focusing on the rest of this session. So what does it take to build this? Well, we have to have that code of conduct, that code of ethics that is developed by the organization and communicated in an ongoing fashion. Leadership has to demonstrate that they're committed to an ethical culture, that they're involved. It's not something that we're just going to tell you what we expect and then disappear. We're not going to tell you what we expect and then do something differently. They need to show that commitment and involvement. Another crucial factor is that the anti-fraud program or the approach to how the organization types fraud or fights fraud has to have an owner, has to have someone designated who is accountable for that program. Too often I go into organizations and I ask, who's responsible for your anti-fraud program? And people just look around and say it's always someone else, and it's not clear. And this is obviously one of the issues that we run into. And so there needs to be somebody who's accountable for the program overall. Obviously, everyone has responsibility in that, but there needs to be somebody that's ultimately accountable. And part of that anti-fraud program should be regular fraud awareness training, because we want to have ongoing training and development of employees so that they know what to look for, they know what ethical behavior looks like, and they understand what is expected. And they also need to understand, and part of the communication is that employees need to understand that their work, their behavior is monitored and evaluated. Because remember, we want to create a perception of detection. We want people to know that there are controls in place, that we want employees to know that work is being checked and evaluated, and that if something inappropriate is happening, that it's likely to be detected. We want them to have that perception of detection. And furthermore, we need to understand, and this is not only communicated, but demonstrated by leadership, that if there is unethical behavior, that there is swift and consistent consequences to that behavior. So they need to have an expectation of those consequences. So these two numbers, we talked about those yesterday, but if you recall, 43%. Let me back up here for a second. The ACFE every 2 years puts out the report to the nations where they survey their certified fraud examiners around the world, and they ask them. They do a detailed survey of all of the cases that they're working on, and they gather these statistics and share these in the report to the nation every 2 years. And in the last one in 2024, and this is consistent with ones in the past, that it was indicated that of all frauds, that were part of this sort of study in this survey, 43% of them, the method that the way they were detected was through tips. This far and away was the number one way that frauds are detected. Not internal audit, not external audit, not management. The number one way that frauds are detected is through tips. And that was 43% of the total cases studied. Of those tips, 52% came from employees. Other tips came from customers, from clients, vendors, other outside sources, but 52%, again, the leading number, came from employees. So that leaves me with I think, a very obvious question, but I think maybe it isn't so obvious. But if the number one way that frauds are detected is through tips, and the number one source of those tips is employees, shouldn't we be training them about what to look for and what to do if they see something that's wrong? And this, to me, it's an obvious question, but again, it's something, apparently it's not so obvious. So what happens is we have employees who want to be part of the solution. We have managers and supervisors that want to be part of the solution, but they haven't been asked to. They don't know how. They don't know what to look for. They haven't been told that this is an expectation. And when we want people to speak up, but we don't give them the power and the know-how to do that, that becomes an explicit weakness in the organization. So what do we do about that? Well, we create and conduct regular fraud awareness training, because what we do is we turn our employees into an army of fraud fighters. And to me, it's one of the most effective ways to help prevent fraud or to help detect fraud early. So as I said, it seems to me an obvious question, but when you look at some statistics, again, from the report to the nations, 29% of organizations, that's almost 1 out of 3, have no fraud awareness training whatsoever. The most common reason, over a third of those, say that, well, fraud training is just not part of the organization culture. Okay, well, that seems to be a potential issue. 61% report that employees spend 2 hours or less per year on fraud training. Well, I have to ask you, how capable do you think employees are going to be in recognizing and reporting fraud if they get less than 2 hours per year of fraud training? I think the answer is pretty obvious. 14% of the organizations reported that board members received no fraud training at all. Board members are in a leadership position. They're expected to provide oversight for the organization. If they have no fraud training, then that kind of trickles down, obviously. And so to me, these are significant issues and point to the need for more fraud awareness training within organizations. These are some interesting statistics from the report to the nation. And at the top, you can see where the impact that, number one, fraud awareness training, fortunately, is on the increase. From 8 years ago, it's increased from 52% of organizations to 63%. And that managers and executives are including in that is also on the increase. But some other things that are interesting is that organizations that don't provide fraud awareness training lost nearly 2 times as much in the median or average loss per fraud case. 199,000 if they didn't have training versus 100,000 average loss if they train both employees and managers. Another thing is interesting is that tips are twice as likely to come from employees who received fraud awareness training, which to me, that's just common sense. If we're training them on what to look for, training them on our expectations, they're going to be far more likely to report it. But the statistics uphold that. Another interesting thing is that nonprofit organizations have the lowest implementation rate. They're the ones the least likely to provide fraud awareness training. And because of that, the duration of a fraud, and the duration is defined as the time from when a fraud starts to when it's detected, is 24 months versus an average of 9 months when fraud awareness training is created. And as we all know, and as is logical, the longer a fraud goes on, the greater the losses. So these are some, I think, some important statistics that, again, support how important this training is. So why does it matter? Well, it educates our employees on what it takes to recognize and report fraud. A lot of times fraud isn't evident. We have to let them know what it looks like, what it smells like, and then also what to do, how to report it. It also empowers our staff. Not only does it communicate the expectation, but it empowers them to act ethically. It gives them support, and it supports and provides evidence of a culture of transparency. So what are some of the key components? Well, it needs to be an ongoing training. It needs to have regular updates and refreshers. This is not a one and done thing. We want to make sure that it's interactive and engaging for employees. I find that video training or self-guided training is far less effective than either coaching or live training. It needs to include real-world scenarios and examples because fraud looks different in different organizations. Fraud looks different in different departments, and that needs to be directed to that and have real-world scenarios and examples of that. And of course, there needs to be some method, some anonymous method for reporting these suspicions and the things that these employees see. And typically that's an anonymous hotline. So what do we do to implement this? Well, the first thing we need to do is to assess the needs of the organization. We need to, number one, have an awareness of fraud risk assessment, right? The organization needs to have some idea of how do we assess and what do we think our fraud risk exposure is. And so what is our needs? Where are we most exposed? And so what are the things that need to be emphasized in the training? So then from there, we're going to design those customized programs, and it may be different from one department to the next. Fraud in a payables department looks a lot different than fraud in payroll or in inventory or warehousing. So it needs to be customized to the organization, not only the organization, but even to specific parts of the organization. And part of any training we need to measure how effective it is and make adjustments. Again, it should be an ongoing living thing. It should involve all levels of staff. It should involve supervisors and managers, as well as the board of directors. We want to use varied training methods that engage the employees, make it interesting, and we want to get their feedback so that we can continuously improve that. So what do we need to focus on in these fraud awareness programs? Well, what are some of the key elements are? Number one, we need to give them the knowledge and skills, right? Employees don't come in informed with fraud knowledge and understanding what fraud is, understanding what constitutes fraud or what doesn't, right? We want to be aware of that, and we want to help them be aware of that. Obviously, part of the fraud awareness training needs to be an injection of the code of ethics and code of conduct. What do we expect? Well, we expect employees to behave ethically, but we also expect them to speak up if they see something that doesn't look right. That code of conduct needs to be a living, breathing mechanism, as we've mentioned before. Again, the perception of detection, the fact that we're continuously monitoring, and that there is zero tolerance for unethical behavior needs to be part of the training program as well. And again, it needs to be customized to that organization and or that part of the organization. So how do we build this? What needs to be part of the fraud awareness program? Well, the first thing we need to help employees understand is that fraud's a problem, right? They may not know that inherently. So just as I did yesterday and started out with an indication of that the typical organization loses 5% of its bottom line to fraud, and that it takes a great deal of additional business to basically recover that, they need to understand the magnitude of the problem. And in essence, part of fraud training is installing a little bit of fear in the beginning that, oh, this is a significant problem. So we need to let them know that this is a real risk to the organization, that this is a damaging risk to the organization. So that's, to me, that's the first step. The second step is, okay, so I understand that it's a risk to the organization, but why do I care? As an employee, as a payroll clerk, or as somebody working in there, why do I care? Why does it matter to me? Well, what we need to do is make it evident to them that if the organization is losing 5% of its bottom line to fraud, then that means that's 5% that's not available for hiring additional workers to help them and work alongside them, for incentives, for bonuses, for benefits, right? That's money that's not available to the organization that could be applied to helping these. So we need to let them know that it costs them as well, that there's a real cost to them, and it does matter to them. And it also it basically infects fraud, and unethical behavior infects the morale of the organization, and they need to understand that aspect of it too. So far, we've let them know how big the problem is and why it matters to them. From there, where we want to go is to start to define it, to start to show them what are some of the different fraud schemes, what do they look like, what does embezzlement look like, what does disbursement fraud look like, what does a kickback scheme look like. We need to get specific about what the fraud schemes are and what those red flags and symptoms are. Where does fraud occur? And how do they recognize it? Again, what are the red flags? What are the symptoms? What should they be looking for? Too often we go into organizations and they say, that fraud's been just recently discovered, and they say, I saw something that looked suspicious, but I just thought everything was okay, or I thought the supervisor already knew about it. I thought it was none of my business, whatever. They shrug it off when in fact they could have helped to shut it down much earlier. So we have to show them very specifically what it looks like. Then we show them how the internal controls are implemented to help prevent it, right? We tie in the fraud risk that we're educating them about, and show them that the steps that they're following that are reflective of the internal controls, that why they're there and what's being done to prevent it. And finally, if they see something that doesn't look right, if they see something that's out of order, out of sorts, what should they do? How do they report it? How are they protected? So these, to me, are the things that are the crucial elements, the things we need to go through and have as part of our fraud awareness training. Another part of that is that there's always three parts to every fraud. And there's the actual theft act itself. There's the concealment of it, right? Every fraud has to be concealed and hidden. And then there's the conversion, where the individual actually is benefiting from the fraud. And all of those come in. So when we go back and we look at the typical employees and the honesty profile, we understand that, number one, the dishonest, we want to have policies to try to keep these individuals out, because no amount of training is going to change them into honest employees. The honest ones, we want to reward them. We want to continue to train them. We want to recognize them. And the fraud awareness training is especially going to help out our situationally honest, because they're going to see it's an expectation. They're going to see that as the norm of the organization, and that's going to sway them into behaving ethically. So leadership has to be committed to this and provide the role modeling. Again, clear communication of values and ethical standards. They have to establish that zero tolerance policy towards fraud. It just needs to be spoken about. Fraud shouldn't be the F word in the organization. It should be recognized. It should be given the importance that it is, and we should train employees about our expectations around it rather than assuming that they're going to know otherwise. So again, we want to, as when we put together that action plan, we want to appoint an owner of the anti-fraud program. We want to make sure everyone's buying in, the employees, the board, all parts, all levels of management and supervision. We want to have a step-by-step guide for implementing this, assign the roles and responsibilities, emphasize interactive training that helps with this. We want to monitor the effectiveness of our fraud prevention, including our fraud training, and modify it and improve and strive for continuous improvement through the feedback we get from the employees and from the measures of effectiveness, and then adjust accordingly. So that was very rapid, very fast, but hopefully it gives you an oversight of why this is important, and what it can actually do for an organization. So I'd like to open up to any questions. Rob, are we seeing any questions out there?
Nothing right now.
Okay, well, while we're waiting, and please, if you have questions, chime in. But one thing I want to say is one question that comes up as an organization when I talk about fraud awareness training is sometimes I get asked, well, by having this fraud awareness training, aren't we actually teaching our employees how to commit fraud? And it's an interesting question because in order to prevent it and to fight it, you do have to know what constitutes it and how it's and the schemes and how it's pulled off. But I'll tell you what, I would rather train my employees and have them all be on the lookout for it and have that individual says, well, now I know better how to do it, but also have them know that all the other people are watching. I think that it's a bet I'll take any day.
Hey, Jim, we do have a question.
Got it.
Sorry to interrupt. Comes from Kayla, and she writes, do you have any suggested platforms, providers of fraud awareness training?
Well, it's funny that you should ask. I do fraud awareness training, but and I do it customized for organizations. But I think that the ACFE is one of the best sources. ACFE is one of the best sources of information. So I recommend that you go to acfe.com. They have a lot of resources, even if you're not a member. The report to the nations is available. And a lot of fraud education materials are available. So that's one source, and to me, one of the best sources. But again, I'm always willing and available to help as well. But the ACFE is a great source.
And then we've got another question that came in that said, well, which I can answer. Are they going to be able to get a recording to refer to? Absolutely. IFL will take care of that. Jim, what do you, oh, we got a couple more messages coming in here. Do you have a, Monica writes in, do you have a list of fraud management agents in each country?
Fraud management agents. You mean people, individuals in each country that can assist with this?
I think that's where she's coming from.
Thing? Yeah. Basically, again, I think that ACFE is a good source. I'm trying to remember. I know there's a member directory that I can see other members. I don't know for someone who's not a member what's available, but again, the ACFE, I think, can always direct you to individuals in a specific country who's out there and who some of the CFEs are. Fantastic. I'm always willing to help out as well, and my contact information is on the screen. I encourage anyone to connect with me through LinkedIn and contact me if you have any questions or if I can assist in any way.
Well, as we mentioned, Jim, fraud is everywhere, and even from the simplest things like your passwords, you have to protect. Speaking of passwords, what do you think Forrest Gump's password is?
What do I think Forrest Gump's password is?
One, Forrest, one.
Okay, I'll have to remember that one. I'll remember that one.
I thought it'd be perfect for you. Jim, thank you very much. That was very informative. We appreciate your half hour. I know you could talk about this forever, so we look forward to
Forever.
seeing you in the future. And it was very informative, and we appreciate your time.